Good morning, everyone. You know, I have seen worse crowds on Thursday morning. So thank you, all of you who are here, for getting up and getting here this morning. We have the start of a great day, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But first, let's talk about the great evening we had last night. Thank you to CDW and Click, and you can see, I found a picture here that was taken last night by our great photographer that has Lauren and Paul and Julie all in it. So Paul and Julie representing our sponsors, and it really was a lovely evening at the aquarium. So thank you to them. Thank you for all of you for being there and making it a great party. The next thing we're going to do is introduce our the last two new members that we had this last year that I mentioned earlier this week, the Carter Center and Mennonite Central Committee, and we have a video for each of them. Between the videos, I'm going to invite the representative from that organization to come up and say a few words if they'd like. So I don't know which order the videos are in. I suspect they're in this order. So if you are the one who's going to speak on behalf of your organization, please be prepared to come up as soon as your video's finished. So here we go.
There are more than 7 billion faces on Earth, some full of hope and dreams, others empty with despair, constrained by barriers that keep them from healthy and productive lives. The Carter Center works to tear down those barriers and create a world where everyone has a chance to live in peace and enjoy basic human rights.
We are willing to take a chance that we might fail if we believe that the ultimate goal is worthwhile, worth our effort, and worth an investment in people who have been neglected by others. She gets three tablets.
The Carter Center has worked in over 80 countries to advance peace and fight devastating diseases.
The Carter Center works in small communities, often poor communities, and we do that work with tens of thousands of community volunteers who are invested in the success of our programs because our programs make their lives and their neighbors' lives so much better.
Over the years, the center has helped improve relations among nations and has worked to promote human rights, resolve conflicts, and strengthen democracies.
Did you vote? Yes. Congratulations.
The center has observed more than 100 elections in countries in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. As a result, leaders are held accountable to the people in places that have never had free and fair elections. The Carter Center is a leader in fighting neglected diseases like guinea worm, river blindness, trachoma, and lymphatic filariasis. These are gone from the developed world, but they still afflict some of the poorest people on Earth.
These diseases are all preventable. If the folks are just given a chance to know what they can do to improve their own lives, then they can transform their own lives into an opportunity for hope and self-respect and anticipation of a better future.
The center also strives to improve access to mental health care and reduce stigma and discrimination against those with mental illnesses.
So today is the last day that you will distribute here.
The people of the Carter Center work for peace, fight disease, and most importantly, bring hope to those who never had it before.
We were the poorest, most isolated people in the world. And often, if we weren't there, there would be nobody to help them.
The Carter Center works where the need is greatest to improve the lives of the poor, the disadvantaged, and those who have no voice.
Very nice, thank you. Do we have somebody from the Carter Center who wants to come speak for a moment? Thank you. Seen you around this week.
Thank you. I won't take too much time. Gosh, you really can't see anything up there.
You really can't.
Yeah, my name is Patty. I'm the Chief IT Officer for the Carter Center. We're happy to be part of NetHope and happy to be part of the community, and look forward to working more with you guys in the future. Thanks.
Thank you.
Relief, development, peace. These are more than just words to MCC. They describe the work we do, and they describe who we are. How? Well, let me start by telling you the story of how MCC came to be. In 1920, people in Soviet Russia were buckling under the weight of revolution, famine, and a typhoid epidemic. So 4 Mennonite men from the area traveled across the world to ask for help. Their pleas convinced Mennonite relief organizations in the US and Canada to come together, forming Mennonite Central Committee. Join us.
Thank you, MCC.
Good morning, everyone. As a Canadian NGO, we'd like to welcome you to Canada. And we're just really thrilled to be a part of NetHope, and we look forward to working with all of you, and thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
All right.
It's wonderful. So we've met our newest member this week, MSF, and then our 3 that joined us this last year, and it's really wonderful to have them with us. Before I talk about this, I want to give a heads up to Planson and the Oracle NetSuite folks that we're going to do their drawing at the very end of my section here in just a couple minutes. So if you're prepared, that'd be great. And if you're not, we'll figure it out. Today, items of note. First of all, after my plea yesterday morning, I really appreciate the fact that you listened. Frederick has told me that evaluations went up in an extraordinary amount yesterday. I would ask that you please keep that up today. Especially remember, too, that you can do an evaluation on the field trips yesterday. It's really helpful for us to know if that's something you enjoy and something we should continue to build into future summits. So thank you for doing that. Thank you for continuing to do that. And remember, you can go backwards and do sessions that you attended on previous days. Just a little teaser, as you know, we've started a tradition where at the end of the day on Thursday, we announce next year's summit location and dates. So I would encourage you to be in the room when Lauren does her few closing remarks at the end of the day today, so that you can be a part of the celebration where we figure out where we're going next. And then last but not least, from that moment, we will move into tonight's opening reception, or not opening, closing reception, that is hosted by Amazon Web Services. So thank you, AWS, for your sponsorship of that, and we'll all have a chance to say goodbye and until next time, except for, I think hopefully about half of you are sticking around for the workshops tomorrow. And if you have not signed up yet and still want to do that, please do. Note on the agenda that you plan to attend one. That would be great. Okay, raffle folks, are you ready? I know that Oracle NetSuite is, so I'm going to ask them to come up first. And they are raffling off an Apple Watch that will be mailed to the winner. And I hope you all took the advantage of this and got your cards in.
All right. Will you be our independent selection committee?
Happy to.
Wow, that's elaborate.
Oh, now this is strange.
Uh-oh.
So Katja Planson, who is going to come up, I believe, and do the next drawing, is the winner of this drawing.
Well, at least it was entertaining. Thank you all.
Thank you. Thank you, Oracle NetSuite, for doing that. That's great. So Katja, are you in the room? She may not even have been on the joke. So we will need to touch base with plants, and they had 2 solar bags they were raffling. There is a slight possibility they didn't get enough cards. I did not check in with them in the last day or two, but they were the ones that were way down here on the end, and they were definitely having trouble getting traffic. So I hope they got enough to do a decent raffle. So we'll check in with them today and fit them in this evening if need be. So now we are going to move right into our morning plenary, and then I want to point out that it's a day of breakout sessions after this session, and they are back to back. You better have your running shoes on and be prepared to just move all over the place. Just the way the schedule worked this year, many of them ended up today. It's going to be a very full day. You'll have to make choices about where you're going to be and what you're going to hear. But before we do all that, we have the pleasure this morning of hearing from Michelle Dennedy. And Michelle is the Vice President and Chief Privacy Officer at Cisco. And I know she is going to talk about a topic that you are all very interested in, because I have heard you talking about this throughout the week in many of the sessions. Sessions that I didn't know would end up on this topic have ended up on this topic. So I think this is a really timely discussion. Michelle, before she was at Cisco, founded an organization called Identity, which is a really cute play on words, and it works to protect the privacy needs of sensitive populations. In her free time, she's also founded a new media site called theidentityproject.com that is focused on child identity theft. She recently wrote a book that she's going to tell you about, and she's also going to give you a copy of it, which is really wonderful. So please join me in welcoming Michelle.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. So this is the button, if you want to forward your slides.
All right, a nice big green arrow. So this is good. You know, I know everyone says it when they get up here, but it truly is weird. You can't see anything. So thank you very much, and thank you particularly for welcoming me into this community. It's an amazing thing to hear what all of you do in so many different ways. I mean, I'm in conferences all the time talking about privacy and technology and finance, et cetera. And so rarely do I hear people talking about waging peace. And so it's such a pleasure to be here. And in fact, in my own team, this is what we talk about. How would we wage peace? And that sounds like a very strange thing for an infrastructure company like Cisco to talk about, But when I'm talking about privacy engineering for humanitarians, I'll give you a very brief story about my own background. When I was an undergraduate, I was studying, taking a Bachelor of Science degree in psychology, and I was working on a robotics research program teaching robotics to children. And in that program, we used an old-fashioned Ricoh arm to do science. And a lot of our kids were quadriplegic and paraplegic children. And my job as the young undergraduate was to watch their science progress. But what we found, and this is back in the days of Apple IIe+, remember those days? That was like new shiny at the time, and everything was bespoke code, of course. There was a bug in our software, as there always is, and what the kids discovered faster than the researchers was they were able to memorize the string of activities to get to the code. They would grab a beaker of anything wet or messy, and then they would hit reset, which sounds like kind of nothing, except when you realize that an industrial robotic arm doesn't reset by just freezing. It goes like this. And then everyone in the room, all the adults go crazy, and the beaker flies out, and the water goes everywhere, and there's millions of dollars of equipment, and everyone's freaking out, except for two people in the room, a young girl, 18 years old, working on a research project, and a child who had transformed from what someone in the parking lot had said to me was the vegetables. This is in the 1980s when we called disabled children vegetables out loud. And suddenly I'm sitting there with a child with a look of delight on his or her face. And that's what I recorded. And that has been so inspirational to my career. Technology does so many things for us. It's so convenient. It helps speed things up. Sometimes it accelerates stupid, right? It makes bad decisions badder, faster. But it also has the great potential to reach out and literally touch a child who has no other capacity to play or make noise or make a mess or cause disruption. And that really inspires me. And my colleagues who you'll meet very shortly can tell you I love disruption. It's a big part of my career. So when we're talking about privacy engineering for humanitarians, I'm talking about privacy engineering. So we're looking at the core assets that are most important to you and your organizations, and how are we protecting them? And there's an element of law here, there's an element of technology here, but most of all, the driving force is, what is that human connection when I collect and I have the fiduciary responsibility to hold information about another fellow human being? So I want to talk about TAC Ops. I'm really excited. I'm not going to do as good an introduction as Sulin is going to do in a moment. We'll get him up on stage. But this is a really exciting program at Cisco where we go into places that need us the most, and we put things together to allow human beings to connect to other human beings. It's another one of these personal information rises to a very, very high level of priority. It's been a very, very interesting and epic year in so many ways. I'm really the below the line kind of girl looking at all of these breaches across the world. There's been a loss of integrity, there's been a loss of trust, there's been a lack of dialogue in our own data. Who can you trust? Who has our data? Who keeps it under control? Years and years ago, when I was at a different company, we built the healthcare system that is enjoyed by BC residents today. You may or may not like it if you're a local, but putting that work together was a really interesting harmonization of trust across agencies and trust across systems that didn't necessarily talk to each other. And here we're seeing years later, we're still losing data at an alarming rate. The above the line that we're going to talk about here, Harvey, Irma, Maria, all wonderful names applied to really tragic situations across the globe. And so that disruption and the disruption of all of the people that Jan was talking about yesterday, some 65 million, and I was really interested to learn that that statistic was twice as many disrupted by natural disasters as well as human manufactured tragedies. This is a photo from last year in Greece. And as you can see, these are people. These are people coming to recover. These are people coming to shelter in place. These are people lost and confused and trying to reconnect. But in every sentence, these are people. People with individual stories. So this is a quote, and I'm going to ask these guys to give the next conversation color around it. But the amazing thing, when I first started talking to Matt and Sulin about their work at TAC Ops, is that one of the first things that any of these people that come to the trucks wanting connectivity, They ask for, where am I, and can I get on the Wi-Fi? And we kind of giggle in North America in particular. I've got 2 teenagers, a tween and a teen, and if you took away their Wi-Fi, it's like taking away their oxygen, right? Can you imagine your kids not tapping away on something? But these people are looking for something a little bit different. Hi, Mom, I'm okay. I'm alive. I made it. Where am I going to next? What's happening in my life story next? Where's my husband? Where's my child? These are connections that Wi-Fi can connect us universally, and it's a similar need and a similar desire across the globe. When I hear that similar story that technology can tell, where am I? How can I connect to my people? How can I keep my people safe at home? To a privacy engineer's brain, that is a specification. That rises up the priority of what is the functionality that I need to build into the system to protect. That's security, it's connectivity, it's availability, it's the whole shmagilla. So even though you may not have a chief privacy officer in your NGO, I'm guessing you probably do not, you definitely have an eye view of what is your most important data. And we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second.
I got the call.
I made the calls.
I organized the meetings.
I drew it on a whiteboard.
So I called the engineers who designed the switches,
The routers.
the servers,
The software.
And I said, let's go.
I approved the budgets.
I spoke to the agencies.
I got the coffee.
We coordinated the logistics.
I overnighted the supplies.
I was there to meet them on the ground.
I drove the truck.
I operated the truck.
We supported the truck.
And I said, do whatever it takes.
How many people does it take to help in a disaster? It takes all of us. There's never been a better time to be proud of what you do.
So it gives me chills when I see that video. That's our CEO at the end, Chuck Robbins. And so you can see from the beginning when we receive a call about a natural disaster, a man-made disaster, to the point where it rises up to our board and our chief executive officer. And he really does say, do whatever it takes. And sometimes that means ferrying Cisco families out of the disaster zone, but oftentimes it means ferrying in these 2 amazing individuals who loves public speaking so much. You should see the look of dismay on their faces. It's like the only thing I can see in the audience. So please come up and join me, Matt Altman and Sulin Hinson from our Cisco Tactical Operations team. Warm welcome. You're friends, it's all good. So we're going to do something a little bit different for the next few minutes. We're going to be, we're simulcasting out, but I also have a new podcast that I hope your teams can use. We wanted to make sure that people understood privacy engineering and what's happening on the edge of privacy engineering. But what I realized is that I've been in this game for well over 20 years. And I can call people, just like you know each other here in the NetHope Summit, and you can connect to each other. I know people in privacy. It's an unfair advantage that NGOs and small businesses in particular don't have. And so we decided that we would launch a podcast. It's called the Privacy Sigma Riders. And Sigma is, my young daughter was diagnosed with a childhood disease when she was quite young, and we had to go through the whole chemo thing. It was horrible. And at one point she said to me, Mama, why can't I be normal? I just want to be normal. And I looked at her and I said, if you want lessons on being normal, I have no idea even where to begin. I've never been normal in my life. So I drew a sigma curve, normal bell curve. And I said, this is where everybody else is. 80% of the planet by definition lives and does everything that everybody else can do. Here's where we are. We're Sigma riders. We're people out on the edge who think in deviations away from normal people. That's where all the fun lives. So the podcast is called The Privacy Sigma Riders, and my latest guest, we're going to do this live. So welcome to the podcast, everyone. Welcome. So we'll start with Sue Lynn, because she looks the most eager. And she's among friends here, because I know I'm just walking around and circulating. You guys are NetHope glitterati. How about that? So tell us about TAC Ops. What is it and why is it?
So Cisco's Tactical Operations is a dedicated team that is focused on providing secure communication solutions in the aftermath of disasters, man-made disasters, other crises in which communications have been either degraded or destroyed or maybe didn't even exist to begin with. So as Michelle alluded to earlier, and all of you in the room have heard it too, communications is aid as much as food, water, and shelter these days. And so, it's really important that in the acute phase of a disaster, we go out and provide those communications in support of governments, first responder organizations, nonprofits like all of you who are working to provide that humanitarian relief, because without the communications, it's really tough to do the job these days.
So you're not just dropping off gear and hoping that FEMA can pick it up and do stuff?
That's correct. So we have a variety of solutions that we have, and then we'll actually send teams in with the equipment to install it, to take care of it.
So Matt, you are one of those teams.
Absolutely.
Tell us a little bit about what it's like. What do you do? So Chuck says do whatever it takes. What does that next step mean to you?
So we'll basically go and do an assessment. We'll go onto the field and see what's needed. We'll talk to the community. We'll talk to the leaders and the first responders. We partner very closely with NetHope. In Puerto Rico right now, we're supporting NetHope in their response to the communities. So just came back from Puerto Rico. We're providing connectivity for first responders, for government agencies, for food distribution, and for NetHope members, and to the community themselves.
So how long do you stay?
It depends. Initial response can be a couple weeks to 3 weeks to even more. Because of the back-to-back scenarios we just had, I came back after a month, and I'm heading back again next week.
Wow, it's incredible. I mean, the level of commitment it takes to go and do what you do.
It's definitely a passion, right? So definitely, I could not imagine doing anything else.
It's great. It's great. And I think I've worked in companies in the past where our CSR efforts were throwing checks at things. We're throwing a lot more than checks at this thing.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been with Cisco for quite a while now, and this is primarily one of the reasons that I've stayed such a long time, because I'm allowed to do this. I definitely think I have one of the best jobs within Cisco.
Very cool. Very cool. So Sue Lynn, there she is in her pants too in the picture.
Not a deployment without tactical pants, right?
Have tactical pants. The truck, what is this truck that we're talking about?
So this is our network emergency response vehicle. This is our pride of joy. We've actually got 2 of these, one's in North Carolina, one's in California. And it's basically a mobile command vehicle. So it's got every imaginable form of communication that you could possibly need. It's got wired and wireless connectivity. It's got IP telephony. It's got radios, radio interoperability, video surveillance, video teleconferencing. So pretty much within about 10 or 15 minutes of rolling up on the scene with this vehicle, we can be providing services, secure services, to the folks operating out of disaster that need to communicate.
Yeah, so when we're talking about secure services, from start to finish in this situation, you're talking about a population at risk, and from what I understand, you're also working with emergency responders, community leaders, other people who may be targeted or at risk. Tell us a little bit more about how do you assess who is what and where, and how do you actually get started doing this stuff?
So they're it's looking at who our customer's going to be. When I say the customer, who we're going to be serving, what their needs are going to be, who may be joining the network. We try to build secure and unsecure networks and try to segment the networks because we know a general population is going to be on it. And then we're closely monitoring what's going on the network, and that's a key component of it, knowing exactly what's happening on your network and who's on it, and trying to mitigate the risk as much as possible.
Yeah, and it sounds pretty flexible. I mean, what you've done in Greece and Syria is different, obviously, from what you're doing in hurricane zones and making sure people have uptime. What would you say, what is kind of the greatest risk from a communications perspective?
I think just, like I said, knowing who's on your network, right? Who may be wanting to do bad things to your network, who's trying to get into your network. And there again, just monitoring that, making sure that when people are joining the network, that they're safe and their data is safe per se, right? That we're able to block a lot of the malware and a lot of the problems that we see on typical enterprise networks. Where general populations don't have an IT staff, where are their IT staff, where are the people who are looking out for them when they're on our network.
And something that's changed for us, when we initially started this, we were really focused on providing the networks to the first responders, a very localized thing, right? And so I think I've heard somebody say it earlier this week, who would think about doing bad things to a humanitarian response, right? But as time goes on, we're seeing more and more of those threats. So when we set up a network and maybe firefighters are on there and they're trying to make travel reservations, credit card numbers are going across the network and things like that, that becomes a risk and that becomes a target. And these days with things like the refugee crisis, now these are probably arguably some of the most vulnerable people in the world having the worst times of their lives, and they may potentially have families back in conflict zones that could still be in danger and things like that. So then, demographics and personal information and that kind of privacy issue really comes into play. And our tenet is to do no harm, right? So we are setting up these networks, but we have to make sure that we're not exposing these people to undue risks by getting on our networks.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that, since you've done this several times and we can start to kind of pattern and plan. We know that unfortunately malware purveyors will try to attack the most vulnerable. If you don't have an address to go home to, and I steal your credit card, it's a lot easier than if it's someone who's living, a relatively normal life and has time to look over their credit card bill. It's a sickness, really, of how some of these guys operate mentally. How do you pattern for this stuff? I mean, how are you prepared? Is there a playbook? How are you sharing this with other people who are joining the teams? And how do you train, schmoes like me who just want to help?
Well, we build templates of how we deploy, right? So we're repetitively doing the same thing, and when we're building these networks, we're going to go out. We know these are the standards we're going to bring, and we're going to stick to these.
And as I understand it, one of your new team members started out as an intern.
Yes.
That is a pretty cool internship, if any of you guys have any young people looking to get into security.
I think the other key here is that the security is built into the system, right? So when we're creating these hastily formed networks out in the field, sometimes people will think, well, I don't have time to do security, right? Let me just set this up. Let me get the Wi-Fi up for the people to get onto because that's important. But if you don't build it into the system, with the technologies that you're using and whatnot, you're not going to do it at the last minute. So when we're designing our solutions, when we're designing our vehicles, our kits and whatnot, we're building security and privacy and protection and all of that into those systems from the start.
I love that because I think over the years in my career in privacy and security, so often you hear, well, I have to ship this product. I have to do whatever my primary thing is, or I'm a doctor. Would you rather me spend money on an identity management system or the latest MRI? And sometimes the answer is the identity management service because you're going to have the correct information in front of the right expert at the right time. And if you plan for that in advance and engineer that into the system, you're not being forced to make judgment calls while you're in the thick of a crisis. So it's great. So I think the final note for you guys is, where do you sit in the organization? Because it's not where you might think it is.
So we are actually part of Cisco's Security and Trust organization. At first you might think, well, why is that? But when you think about how important security is to all of our solutions and what we do and how we protect the people that we serve, it really actually makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, it's great. And sometimes you have to organize for the synergies that you want to have happen. So I just want to thank you guys. You made it through on stage.
Thank you.
Everybody loved you, right? Thank you guys so much. So those guys really are the stars of the show. They invited me because I wanted to come back to Vancouver, but so bringing NetHome to privacy design and privacy design to NetHope. I only have a few more minutes here to talk about it. I did write a book along with my father and my business partner. It's called the Privacy Engineering Manifesto. And we used all open standards to really think about how do you convert what can be very esoteric and complicated policies and transform that esoterica into specifications and requirements that you can give to a Scrum Master if you're in an Agile environment, or you can make sure are your specifications in a waterfall development environment. It's not as easy as you might think. even coming up with the word reasonable security. Now, we're in a common law nation here in Canada, as well as in North America, but many jurisdictions are in a civil law instance. So even something reasonable means something different. And then if you go over to a lot of the Asiatic countries, they don't have a system of law that is based on trial and error reasonableness. They need to have specific requirements. So to a lawyer's mind, we're trained to say things like it depends, reasonable, best efforts, etc. To an engineer's mind, that sounds like wah, 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 wah. So what we tried to do is work together using standards like metadata modeling, kind of a lost art amongst IT professionals, and UML and business requirements processing. Now that might sound like a very heavy weight. I was aware of that when we wrote the book, and so we started kind of testing the processes out. And in the startup communities around Silicon Valley, they said, oh, minimally viable product means that we worry about security and privacy later. That's for the acquisition company. I've been working really hard with the VCs in particular, and with my own M&A group. If you haven't designed privacy and security in from day one, you will take a pay cut when we buy you. That's going to become the industry norm. It's not today, but it will be. And the reason is this: if you can't manage a one feature control over your information, I don't want you coming into my bigger environment and poisoning the rest of my networks. It's going to cost me an astronomical amount when at the instance you can. So what we did is in the book, and there's a free copy for all of you, and it's digitally available for free online. We sat down with my 17-year-old nephew. He's now graduating with a degree in computer science, proud to say. And we said, what do you like to do? He's a cross-country runner. So we designed in an afternoon with a pizza, using privacy engineering techniques, how to do a runner's app. And if you think about the communities that you serve, think about all the information that goes into a runner's app for a child. There might be some kids who are under 13, so you have federal law that kicks into place there for children's law. You might have a security need to make sure the team from across town doesn't see your runs. Maybe you want a dialogue with coaches and teachers, and so you have an educational privacy concern. On and on and on. Very simple transaction of taking a run every day and scheduling your races and maintaining that data of state is something that you can actually design for in advance and then decide the techniques that you want to deploy. Some will be heavier weight than others, and some will be the most important thing that you decide is core. And there are features that you might want to drop off just because they're too hard and too expensive and they're not core to your mission. And so that is in a humanitarian setting in particular, where sometimes we are just bare down to the bare bones. And I sit on the board of the Northern California chapter of the MS Society. You know, we get calls from patients, we get suicide hotline calls, we get calls from doctors and researchers and so on and so on. There's a lot of information that flows into that NGO, and they don't have the money to pay for a professional privacy officer. So they're either kind of stuck with whatever they can buy off the shelf, or they can sit down and really look at their data assets and go through this protocol of what is the process flow of information across my networks. And it doesn't have to be a monumental task. It has to be in line with your monumental task. And think about the information that you need. Think about the donors. Think about the people that you serve. Think about your volunteer army. So many of these folks depend absolutely on volunteerism. And so you have to really understand how to respect and manage that information as well. We try to add some fun in this. This is a couple weeks ago. That's not a very good look for me. We had a 48-hour game jam in Berlin, and we invited the gaming community to come in and say, what would it be like to protect your information if you were an advocate? What would it be like to protect your information if you're a corporate player who didn't want to lose information and lose revenue? What would it be like if you just wanted to get on the Wi-Fi securely as you're traveling through airports? And so we invited 30 players in, 5 groups they broke down, and for 48 hours, and yes, I stayed the whole time, we did a game jam, and we came up with some really interesting concepts. I called it Pokemon for data, so sorry if there's any trademark people in the audience. But that's what we want to do. We want to figure out how do we do fast, quick, and dirty problem solving with privacy engineering and security engineering. Not to make anyone nervous, but we're going to talk about this in the next panel. 211 days and counting. And the interesting thing about GDPR, and we'll talk about it in the next panel, so I won't even define the acronym now, but it's not a Y2K event. May 26 will come. May 25 is when enforcement begins in the European Union. May 26 is when the world has already changed to say that information about human beings deserves the same level of respect and fiduciary care as our currency. That's the bellwether change that's about to happen. So if you're nervous about GDPR, you should be. We'll make it better. There's a book for you. That will help. And we'll talk about that in a bit. And then this is a picture of our little ninja. When I first had him drawn, I was working for Intel at the time, and I had a cartoonist draw pictures of ninjas to be our privacy policy. I know you all don't read I'm sure you guys read my privacy policy, right? Yay! That's all right. I don't read them either. So I did a cartoon for Intel, and the first ones that came back were all like muscly and like bodice rippers and stuff. And I said, "Have you met the security people?" Yeah, we don't look like that. So here's my nerdy little ninja. His pants are too short, and he's fighting the good fight. So he still has. Now I call it the M for Michelle, since I don't work for McAfee Intel anymore. But we do have the manifesto available. There's 32 different little blurbs in there from practitioners around the world. Like I said, it's free, apress.com, or on your Kindle or your Nook device. You can download it for free. I'm not a very good businesswoman, but I did want this information to be out in the wild. We're also turning it into an IEEE standard under the Ethics Committee. 7002 is the standard. So it will be a part of ethics engineering and ethical design that will be required on an international scale. And that's it. This is our next step. Within 2 minutes, I'm watching the countdown clock. This has never happened for me. I'm really excited. But here are some places where you can get more information about privacy. We're going to continue to have experts on our podcast talking about how to get ready for GDPR, what's going on in Asia Pacific and the rest of the world. Canada has always been a leader in privacy, so watch this space as well. Canada is the great bridge between Asia and Europe, and I'm sure that the update to PIPEDA and the other laws up here will be as instructive as they have always been, with a dose of pragmatic and a dose of European, kind of all into a lovely melange. The US is not going to have a federal bill anytime soon, and for the next couple of years I say thank you. But we'll get there. We'll keep fighting the good fight. So thank you very much for your attention, and now we'll hear more about stuff. He told me to stay here. Yeah. Thank you. Usually I get to.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thank you
for joining us.
I'm going to turn this off.
Hi, I'm Joe Libanovich. I'm the Director of Information Security and ICT Operations at Catholic Relief Services, and it's my great pleasure to ask Michelle to join me on stage here to do a little speculation about the EU General Data Protection Regulation and say its impact to our sector immediately, and say the impact of data protection writ large across the world. I'd also like to ask Dr. John Gent, the CEO and co-founder of Cytorus, an organization that's been working with our community for the better part of 2 years now, yes?
Yes.
Roughly 2
Almost
years,
3,
sort
I
of
think.
preparing some of our organizations for this EU GDPR imperative, now 211 days away. And we're gonna do a little discussion about what this is gonna look like in just a handful of months. So to start, John, fast forward 211 days, it's May 25th, maybe May 26th. What does the world look like post EU GDPR go live?
Yeah, I think that's the $1 million question, isn't it? Everyone kind of wants to know. I think there's a couple of things really to sort of state about the GDPR, just to put into a little bit of context as well. Obviously, it's a regulation that's coming into effect across the EEA on the same day, but it's about personal data.
And it's not, we hear words like privacy, and that's obviously critically important. We hear a lot about information security, and we obviously hear a lot about the GDPR. But the GDPR itself is pretty much a byproduct of this massive increase in capability that we now have around processing personal data. And the first step in trying to understand how to deal with it is to accept that as the fundamental sort of truth about it, rather than just ultimately trying to comply with something without really understanding why. And it's because there's huge value in the personal data that's there. Boston Consulting Group, I think, put the value of just European citizens' data alone to be in the region of €1 trillion by 2020. And most sectors get a real good sense of that. Working a lot with our friends here in NetHope, I don't think it's as easily understood, the value of personal data, as opposed to just wanting to comply. I think there's an opportunity to actually achieve strategic objectives by being good at processing personal data, which is ultimately what we want to do. Jan Egeland yesterday touched on this when he said that the technology that's available now enables organizations to actually achieve their strategic objectives a lot quicker. So I think that's an important point just to say to them almost straight off the bat. And then to answer your specific question, the GDPR really focuses in on accountability more than anything else, really. It is a replacement regulation, but that being said, everything in it is well understood. Actually, how to go about complying with the GDPR, believe it or not, is generally understood. The concepts there are quite familiar with the existing legislation. The big change is really accountability. And in practice, what that means is, were there to be a breach, let's say today, with an organization, one of the Information Commissioner's Office would likely be informed of it, hopefully by the organization themselves, and they would do an investigation, they would assess the actual situation, and they may issue a small fine, and perhaps an information notice with an enforcement notice or something like that. Post the 25th of May, the first thing they're going to do is they're going to ask the organization to prove compliance. That's the headline change with the GDPR. I mean, it's a fairly large regulation. There's over 99 articles of it, but over 30 of them actually refer to this concept of demonstrating and proving compliance. And they do it through a multitude of ways, with privacy by design, which Michelle talked about quite a bit, privacy by default, the role of the DPO, all of these things. But the take-home message, long story short, is from post 25th of May, the obligations are going to be on organizations to prove and demonstrate compliance, which sounds like a subtle change, but in practice actually quite difficult to do.
Yeah, Michelle, so how does this going to impact Cisco on May 26th?
Oh, it's incredible how the way processors interrelate with each other is changing. Mm-hmm. So Cisco is largely a B2B organization, and largely in the past haven't had access to information. However, our business is transforming into a digitized business, just as everyone else's is, so we have more access to information, so that is changing our nature of obligations. And then the concept of, it used to be that a so-called controller, the one who calls the shots, if you will, on data, would take primary liability, and then the downstream processors, like a Cisco, would say, well, as long as I followed the security rules that you gave to me, I've pretty much handed off my liability back to the controller. No more. Under GDPR, everyone is implicated in the pool of fiduciary care for data. So if you have access to data, whether you're a processor or a controller, you have to step up your game and show how you're complying, show how you're monitoring your data, finding your data, and making sure that there is this accountability mechanism and even culture controls like training.
John, so
Can I add to that, actually? Because I think that's a really good point. I mean, ever since the UN Declaration of Human Rights, when data protection really came on the agenda from a legislative basis, they've always been extending the scope of where data protection actually sits. And this is one of those examples where it's not just the data controller that's liable, it's also the data controller and the data processor. And to a large degree, it has a global remit. So not just if you're, because of the fact that you're extending out to the data processor, we live in such a connected world that it's hard to see how organizations really don't have an obligation, even if they don't necessarily tick the box of processing European citizens' data or doing the processing within an EEA jurisdiction, which is sort of referenced scope. But there's certainly a drive to extend the scope of the GDPR along those lines, which is an interesting trend in itself.
In that controller-processor dynamic, where do we fit? Are we one or the other, or both?
You're both. I mean, in every organization that we work with, you're always both. Most organizations will always be both. There's situations where you are controlling the use of the data. There's also situations where some NetHope members would use other services to help them achieve their strategic objectives, other members in many cases. So it's always a case of both. From a GDPR perspective, it's important to understand when I'm a data controller and when I'm a data processor. And I suppose looking at it singularly through the lines of the GDPR, that's done through what's known as the processing activity logs. It's basically describing what it is you're doing with the data and understanding the nature of the relationships that you have for those processing activities.
Michelle, you mentioned the reasonableness of security. It's sort of a very amorphous term, and it's embedded within the regulation, but there's no case law yet to define what that means. Do you have a sense of what reasonableness will mean beginning in the end of May?
Yeah, so this is me as a business person, not as a legal person.
Right, yeah, absolutely. No advice in any way, shape, or form.
No legal advice, and probably less legal competency than I would like to remember that I once had before I was a business lead with a lawyer backing me up. I've totally lost my train of thought now because I'm stuck in like that land. Where is this all going to go? I don't know. Say your question again.
Reasonableness. Defining reasonableness in May and June of next year.
I know, I'm kind of stuck in reason. So is it the term reasonableness or what are the practices? So I guess what I'll do is I'll kind of go down the practical side. I'm thinking in my mind is, one half of my mind is saying, what does reasonableness in contract mean? And I think that is a wide open standard. So if I was contracting with someone, I would be a lot more specific than reasonable, technical, physical, administrative controls. From an actual control standpoint of what is reasonable, I think we're in for an interesting ride. I think the trouble that you have where there are breaches, the minute that it's breached, it seems unreasonable. So in the Target breach that we had, and a criminal actually went through a vendor providing HVAC services, that suddenly became unreasonable that we weren't all monitoring our HVAC physical vendors for cybersecurity. Before Target, that was completely reasonable. I shouldn't say completely reasonable, but we in Geekland thought that was outrageous anyway. Right. But I think to the normal Joe Schmo, it would have been a reasonable thing to assume that it's really your IT vendors that you have to keep a close watch on and just make sure that you've vetted the physical people that are coming onto your property. So that's the problem, is the ball always changes. So as the attackers get smarter, and we know that there's holes, if you haven't patched your systems, that becomes unreasonable. Where there's a new kind of hybrid type of attacker approach, it's going to be a moving, evolving ball.
Yeah, that's exactly our experience. I mean, proportionality is key really here. We would see a lot of situations throughout Europe really where if there was a breach, if there was a situation where there was an organization and they've done literally nothing with respect to data protection, you would get a typical type response from the commissioner's office. That being said, if you had the same organization, let's say, that had the same type of breach and they had a privacy program and they were trying to do the right thing, like, it's impossible to protect yourself from breaches all the time. Every organization is going to have a breach at some point in the future. And this is where proportionality really kicks in.
And I think that's even changed, though. I think in the past, you didn't get such a break. Now everyone's like, okay, you're gonna get breached.
This is absolutely, that's the case. I mean, there was a case a couple of weeks back in the UK where an organization was fined even though they were hacked, but they weren't considered by the ICO to actually have sufficient. They didn't do pen testing, the basics. They didn't have the basics, and they were hacked, and that was considered not reasonable.
Yeah.
And they got a fine.
And even for the smallest NGO, if you're getting a patch update warning and you aren't routinely updating your software, I think that's going to be deemed unreasonable, even if you don't have a sophisticated back-end IT program. So I think The other piece of this that's so fascinating to me is that this is getting pushed out to the end user again too. There are responsibilities for every end user. If you're an organization, you have to train them and tell them what to do. And then if you've got the things like updated patches, those are almost always security patches. So when you get one of those update requirements, except maybe Apple, sometimes I wonder. I'm sorry, Apple, if you're watching.
Dig at Apple, yeah.
No digs. We partner with Apple, but I did just update my OS, and it's
yeah.
It's not good.
Yeah, I decided not to before coming here to ensure that my phone worked. I was at a Gartner event just a few days ago, and they mentioned that the estimate is 50% of all organizations won't be ready. So in speaking to this proportionality and reasonableness, is it safe to say that May 26 comes around, it's perhaps far more important to have a story to tell around your path to compliance, your path to being reasonable, than it is to having a checklist of things you've done?
Yeah, I think it's very unlikely 50% of organizations will be compliant by the 25th of May. I think it's incredibly important that organizations are on the path to have done something to actually help implement the GDPR. Absolutely, I think that's critical. All of the commissioners across Europe are saying the same thing. They're all beating this drum about accountability and demonstrating compliance, and it's very hard to do that if you've done nothing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So let's fast forward a few years. We're 2020. GDPR has been effective for a couple of years. Perhaps there's case law now. Things like reasonableness have been better defined. What's changed in Europe and maybe more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, we focus on this quite a bit, actually, this question, just even from our own product development point of view. I mean, the GDPR, as even from Sator, so we're a data protection firm, and GDPR takes up a lot of our time these days. But we would actually sort of describe ourselves as a personal data company. It's not just about, from a trends perspective, it's not just about the GDPR, it's about this massive increase in processing of personal data. I mean, we start to see it everywhere now. I mean, even, I don't know if people were at the university yesterday looking at some of the organizations with the products that they were about to release. Every one of them, bar I think one, was processing huge amounts of personal data, and it's going to be inescapable. And the view we would have is whether it's an NGO or whether it's a commercial entity, to be successful in the future, in 5-10 years' time, you're going to have to be good at processing personal data. Whether it's the GDPR or whether it's something else, we don't see that. We don't see that changing. It's going to be more of an asset, notwithstanding the fact it's a fundamental human right. So we have a duty of care to processing the personal data of the data subjects. But companies that are good at that are going to have such a competitive advantage. They're going to be better at achieving their strategic objectives from the NGO sector. And we don't see that trend. We see it accelerating, in fact. We don't see it decreasing post 25th of May or over the next 5-10 years.
Yeah, I think so. You can't do privacy and not be an optimist. So I'll give you the optimist view. I've heard my entire career that privacy is dead and it's not coming back. Well, it's been over 20 years for me. It's not dead.
Yeah.
I think the parameters of what we find private and that space to be alone, to be creative, to have our thoughts, to do our silly dancing in front of the mirror to get ourselves psyched up, those places will still be sacred, and they're pretty stable across all cultures, even collective cultures that live in much closer proximity, that have a closer personal space, that have ancestry, pride, and things like faith that are very important to them. Those people too have an individual need for a place of their own, a self-determinative place of their own. So I don't think that privacy will go away as a recognized human right. I think the other thing that gives me a lot of hope is that as we get better and better at processing and competing with our competency around data, we're going to start to see the understanding that data is a currency. And so there'll be more and more of these companies attempting to put you in the center of your control of which identity you want to share where, and more businesses that recognize that exploitation without participation is not going to be a good business model going forward. Today, it's almost impossible to not see the economic powerhouse of advertising, but that will change. We are already changing it as a collective society, deciding we want to block ads, or we want to use different services, or we're hopping around. And I'm watching my own 2 young girls curating identities, one for school, one for home, one for grandma, one for best friends. That curation will be surrounded by technologies that are capable of that curation. And so I think just as today, you wouldn't think about taking a bunch of donor money in, not reporting back on what happened to that money, not putting it in a safe place, not spending it well and true to your mission, so too will be the case of collection of data about people.
When speaking about the looking at privacy as an opportunity, is that the way Cisco's looking at it? That the processing of data and the protection of privacy is not a threat so much as an opportunity for Cisco and to exert a competitive advantage?
Absolutely. So we actually cracked my organization in half. The compliance half is led by a different person. So she operationalizes things like breach repair, incident response, and all that kind of mapping activity. So we work in conjunction. My team works on proactively privacy engineering, figuring out what is the most impactful tool that we can put on to put organizations in control of their data and know where it is and be sentient about it. And then the other side of my organization does data valuation. So we look at things like what I call data friction. How long does it take an average deal that comes in the door to close based on data privacy and protection in the various regions around the world? And the answer can be anywhere from 6 weeks to 2 weeks. And when we can reduce that time with publicly available privacy impact assessments, with data maps, with awareness of our privacy engineering tools and capabilities, we can actually reduce that friction time, reduce the cost in our legal costs, in our churn costs for customers, et cetera. Those are real dollars I'm putting right back on the board again. And so as the company's recognizing this on Cisco, we're starting to share those capabilities with our customers going forward to say that when you are good at curating data as you would anything else that's sacred to your business, you will do better.
Yeah, when you're providing advisory to our sector and others, is that the way you're sort of pitching?
It absolutely is. I mean, many of the NetHope members would be familiar with the capability benchmark we did a couple of years back. We've done that in other sectors as well. And what you find is in some other sectors where organizations, particularly they're outliers granted, but where organizations do become really capable at processing personal data, the benefits they get are extreme. Insofar as they've better access to information, they've better routes to market, they have better information about their customers, they can reach them quicker. They have information that they need to have when they need it, and it offers a huge advantage to them. I think within the NGO sector, I think everyone would probably agree we're probably on the lower end of the capability in terms of where we would want to be in processing personal data, and we would want to get to the point where it's actually becoming beneficial in helping achieve the strategic objectives rather than just being seen as perhaps a cost center or a compliance act in that sense.
Further fast forwarding and maybe extending further out. So we're primarily talking about the EU jurisdiction and policy there. And regulatory policy is strong in North America, in Europe, parts of Asia, but not so strong in the global South. What impact do you think this regulation is going to have broadly across the world, especially in those places where we operate, where there is not a very substantial regulatory environment?
I think eventually the GDPR will likely set the standard. So, I mean, even if you look at some of the existing data protection legislations across the world, like the South African legislation is almost a carbon copy of the Irish Data Protection Act, as an example, and it tends to get copied. Best practice, the GDPR is effectively a legislative basis for what best practice is in any event. So that tends to get copied and rolled out. Now, admittedly, that's going to take a while in a lot of the jurisdictions that you're referring to. But it's really, hopefully, it's a question of when rather than if. In the case of actually catching up to being effective at implementing best practice in this space.
Yeah, we are already seeing attempts, and you're exactly spot on with the carbon copying. It's really fascinating. So you see places like Argentina have a very European style legislation, but not necessarily a European style system of governance and trust in their own government, and they still are sort of outliving the shadows of the past. And then you're seeing concepts like in Brazil of something called habeas data, which was really the beginning of this movement for localization of data, which I think is a fascinating trend, because for a lot of the networks to work, data does transfer cross-border. We have to recognize and find a way to harmonize those rules and regulations, because otherwise everything is sort of black market transfer right now, and that's what's happening in the world. Even these jurisdictions that say this data may only stay within my borders, they still want 24/7 uptime. They still want to be able to use their smartphones wherever they travel in the world and not buy a new phone every time they cross a border. So we're going to have to get better on a global policy level of saying, I believe that having more digital capability, from an educational perspective, can lift some of these places out of poverty. I believe if we're talking like 2050, we could get over 1 billion people above the poverty line if they had enough capability to understand data currency. There's enough data capital and currency in these 7 billion human beings. It can't all be selling cat videos to the same billion people. Please. It really can't. But to do that, we have to get over some hurdles. And some of these hurdles, you see a reaction to GDPR. You're going to go with 4% of global turnover for your penalties. I'm doing criminal liability. So in Japan, it's illegal to transfer your information out of Japan. It's a criminal offense unless you do certain things. Only 17 companies have signed up for an accountability agent. And we're one of those companies, but 17 companies isn't a lot when you talk about a global marketplace. So we're going to see a lot more movement, and I'm hoping, although I did say this in 2000, but I'm still hoping we're going to see some harmonization. We're going to see what happened in the law of the Admiralty in the 1500s, where there were pirates that were jumping on ships. There was a commercial interest in getting goods back and forth and trade routes. There were adventurous people who were willing to innovate and come up with new ways of traveling. And so somehow we came together and decided the law of the sea. Well, we need a law of the internet, and we're not there yet, but I'm hoping by 2050, in my retirement, I will see it.
So is it safe, either be a safe bet to assume if you're an organization in our community that may or may not have enormous exposure? For example, Catholic Relief Services does not have enormous exposure to the GDPR. But given the assumption that this particular regulatory legislation is going to sort of be carbon copied all over the world, is it a relatively safe bet that using that as the highest common denominator to begin to build out a privacy program, begin to change the way your organization thinks about privacy, is probably the appropriate path to take?
Yeah, I mean, certainly, I would certainly advocate that approach. Organizations should probably ask themselves, are they going to be processing more or less personal data over the next 5 to 10 year period? And if the answer to that is significantly more personal data, then at some point you're going to have to actually comply with the best standard, not that it is a standard, but the best regulation and the highest levels of compliance within that. And the GDPR is the current sort of thing to aim for within that. So it will be very good practice to start aiming for that and start to get some of the benefits as well of actually having a high level of capability of processing personal data along those lines. I think it's going to be difficult for organizations if they leave it too late, where they'll reach a point sometime in the future where all of a sudden, and I don't know exactly when, where all of a sudden they're going to have a realization that they're going to have a massive change program to get themselves up to scratch from where they need to be. And that could be the case where, they're not allowed to go for some funding because it's a requirement that everyone has to be compliant with the GDPR. Or there could be a massive breach and all of a sudden reputation damage is on the table because they're not necessarily compliant with the GDPR. So, I mean, it will be very good practice to start the journey as early as possible in much respects. I think it's a given that over time, everyone's going to have to comply with the GDPR or some version of it that will ultimately apply to them. So I would certainly advocate that approach, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, here's the good news. So I'll start with the bad news and I'll work to the good news. The bad news is one of the earliest cases under the 95 directive, which is the kind of current base layer of what we have today. There was a woman who was at church and she sent around a newsletter and she copied all of her fellow parishioners and she said, please pray for Bill. Bill has a bad back. Well, she was actually brought into court that this was a privacy violation of his healthcare data. This is a basic human right, and she had violated this man's data, and that was deemed to be a violation of the law. Here you have the most innocent of actors wanting to do something good in your kind of context, right? Pray for me. And then putting out a list that she was one of these church administrators, but she had access to a list. She used it for a purpose that people didn't give it to her for. It was in violation of the law, and she was fined. And it was kind of a shocking case to all of us. So the downside is there will be those weird things. And so you have to kind of not go crazy. We've seen this in the US where HIPAA has been used as a shield to do the right thing rather than what it should be is protecting that data. So the good news is that the FAIR principles, if you really break down the FAIR principles of data protection and privacy, really go back, way back to when Moses is coming down with tablets. Do unto others as you would have done unto you. It's in the Code of Hammurabi of you shall not spy into the window of your neighbor and watch his wife in a state of undress. There are rules that were sometimes technologically you can violate people's privacies, but there have been rules and cultural mores against doing that, from the beginning of time. So not to get too crazy. I mean, we've already gone to the Code of Hammurabi. I mean, we're going to throw down on this one. But for agencies that particularly have a charitable focus and a global focus, really thinking about what is that core asset and why did you get it in the first place, and what are you going to do with it afterwards? Having that dialogue and documenting that dialogue is that accountability framework. You may not be calling it the right trigger names that you're going to want to dust off and get right, but you're going to at least be in a good place where you probably are on the right track for compliance. So start with what's real and go to compliance. Don't start with compliance and then go to what's real. Yeah. I've seen a lot of companies make that big fail.
So I think we actually have a few minutes left here, and I'd like to take this opportunity to open the floor up for questions of our panel here. And I can't see their hands, so I'm going to rely on Frederick to perhaps bring a microphone around, assuming that there are any questions these last few minutes.
It's like Pac-Man. I can just see shapes running around.
We'll nod in your general direction.
There'll be one on each side of the room, so.
Okay. Well, just start talking, I guess, and then we'll respond. Are there any questions? There's one back here.
Hi, my name is Paul Munster from MasterCard. I was wondering if European funding for projects outside of the European region invoke the regulations.
They can, if there is part of the funding information being transferred from the funding recipient back to the funding body, then they're basically becoming a data processor. And then in that scenario, there'd be an obligation for the data processor to be compliant with the GDPR. So they can, not necessarily, not all the time, but most of the time.
If an organization reached GDPR -10 and had found itself having done nothing, what would you say they should do?
Look out.
Can I answer that?
Yeah,
please.
Sure, yeah.
You.
As complex and as nuanced as the GDPR can get, ultimately the best place to start is in describing what you're doing with the data. And that sounds like a simple task, but it can actually be quite complex. You don't need to get right down into the weeds, but just describe what processing activities you're actually doing with the data. What are you actually doing? And then from that, apply a sense of data protection knowledge over that to identify risks. I'm really painting with a very big brush here. But once you have that, then put in actions to ultimately mitigate against those risks. And that process will help you ultimately demonstrate that you're doing something and that you're trying to be compliant with the GDPR. And that's the process that I would suggest organizations go down sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I would start as soon as possible,
Yeah.
but even if it's May 24th, you want to separate in sort of three columns: people, process, technology. what are your people doing, and what's your context diagram? Who are your users, who's your processor, who's your auditor? Think broadly about who touches your data, whether it's, auditors, regulators. I think about them in my context. How would I show something if law enforcement had questions? Those are your people. What processes are you doing to and from and with data? Make a list. And then technology, what are the tools and services that you're currently using? And then looking at not just the contractual requirements, are they safe, are they secure, do they say anything about that? And then how and where are they processing that data? And so it's not a simple thing at all. It can be a very, very complex and multi-year situation, but you can start in that very simple way and where your technology is not up to snuff, make sure you've got a killer training program. If your training program and your culture is good, then start to work on these other pieces. And all of these things kind of come into focus together, but it's all about balancing and juggling these balls and figuring out where I've got a weakness, I want to have a mitigating circumstance. So it's not just playing defense against the regulator again, it really is, what is your core mission? And then don't be afraid to delete data. If there's anything I can leave these people with today, do not retain data. We are a world like hoarders. You know that show Hoarders, Guilty Pleasure, anyone? I watch it. Makes me feel better about my garage. We used to think that you collect as much data because it might be useful someday. If it's not fresh, it's not good. Treat your data like you treat your vegetables.
Yeah. John, it's perhaps a reasonable segue to plug your session.
Yeah, it's so there's a talk up at 11, is it? 11 o'clock. It's in one of the breakout sessions on the GDPR. So, yeah, I'll go into this in a little more detail at that talk.
Okay, great.
Call him a lot.
Thanks.
Here, let's. Thanks so much for a brilliant presentation, particularly in how to find value in what's essentially a boring compliance issue for a lot of us.
It's not boring.
What have you seen some of the best organizations do in terms of leveraging beyond IT departments? Because like all real compliance issues, this is going to take a lot more than IT. Where does it usually live in a successful organization that really does this well? And how do you separate what's core IT and non-core IT and rolling something like this out for a real culture change?
Yeah, I mean, where we see this work well, generally organizations have two things in place. One would be what you might call the organizational structure. And it's not that it just sits, data protection doesn't just sit in IT, and it definitely doesn't sit in just legal. It has to have real boots on the ground impact. So it's an organizational, company-wide issue. And you have to have the correct organizational structure in place in order to do that. And generally, that's the DPO with what we would call DP champions, which you would have across different jurisdictions and different functions and different teams within the organization. And then have the right tools to do the job. I mean, very often it's as easy to get it right as it is to get it wrong, which may be a surprise to a lot of organizations. That sometimes this isn't rocket science. This can be quite easy to get right sometimes, provided there's a will to actually to do that. And I know they're very high-level components, but what we tend to see, and we've helped a lot of organizations, not just in NGO sector, but across multiple sectors, and they are two commonalities that keep coming back where we see organizations do it well. We would say organizational structure one, tools to do the job two.
Yep, I think that's right. I think the other place you see privacy living, they're either somewhere down, maybe under the CISO, and that's tough because the CISOs already have a really tough time keeping things secure, much less looking at the content and figuring out the intention and the proportionality of data, which is critical to do this well. The other place you see it is sometimes in legal. And I have lived in all of these areas over the span of my career. It depends very much on your organization. If your legal team, if you address anyone from legal when they're not in the room as legal, I advise you not to put your CPO there, because that's a compliance organization. And so your kind of corporate ethos is like, oh, legal. I went to law school. It was hard. Like, you should use my name. But when I moved into a corporation, it suddenly was like Jim, Bob, Joe, and legal. So before the meeting even starts, like they're so excited to hear from privacy from me. So we've moved it out. I report under the COO. So we're in operations. We're an operational team. We're embedded with engineering. We're in with the business. I work with the M&A practice. We're boots on the ground. I think it's chapter 11 in my book. We talk about whether you want a hub and spoke or whether you want a federated model. So read our book, it's free.
I think operations is a great place for it, because you need to understand, to go back to the starting point we just discussed, describing what you're actually doing with the data. Operations is a really good place to actually do that. I also think it's, and just to perhaps flag it as well, sometimes it can be a risk, and like we've several solicitors and as well as IT security specialists, so I don't mean this in any disparaging way, but if your objective is just to cover off liability, I think that's a risk in itself, because you need to be able to process personal data in an effective way, which is more than just trying to cover off liability. So sometimes legal is not the best place to have the function.
And it should be fun. I mean, you guys are here serving other people. You all could get paid a lot more raping and pillaging like the rest of us in corporate land, right? So caring about your data and caring about your constituency probably comes pretty naturally to you. And if you apply that same ethos to the data about these people and about your volunteers and about your donors, I think you'll find that this actually is a very, very rewarding practice to do data protection and security quite well. It's you would never see a crying baby on the ground and not pick it up and hold it to you. To me, my data is my babies. Pick them up and I hold them close. So I hope you'll enjoy it as well as get it done before May 25.
So I'm being shown here on the clock that we've run out of time. So I'd like to real quickly thank our presenters here, our panelists for joining us this morning. So.
Thank you.
And is it my